You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, DNA ID, Malice, All Things Crime, and Riddle Me That. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking.
On June 26, 1970, the Zodiac killer would continue his threat to use a bomb, yet again focusing on schoolchildren for maximum terror. His letter stated, quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I have become very upset with the people of San Francisco Bay Area. They have not complied with my wishes for them to wear some nice Zodiac buttons. I promised to punish them if they did not comply by annihilating a full school bus. But now school is out for the summer, so I punished them in another way. I shot a man sitting in a parked car with a .38. The Zodiac updated his victim count to 12 alongside his crosshair symbol, while again mocking the San Francisco Police Department by placing SFPD 0 in the letter. The further threats were accompanied by another code, known as the Z32, because it contained 32 ciphertext characters, with only 3 repeating characters, thereby making it practically unsolvable without a key. The remainder of the letter read, "The map coupled with this code will tell you where the bomb is set. You have until next fall to dig it up." The Zodiac also inserted a Phillips 66 map of San Francisco and the vicinity into the correspondence, in which he drew his crosshair symbol centered over Mount Diablo, and issued the instructions of, quote, "is to be set to Mag N." Magnetic north was approximately 17 degrees in 1970. The compass points of north, east, south, and west on the crosshairs were allotted the numbers 0, 3, 6, and 9, respectively, to partially mirror clock face. Although the communication only made claim to the killing of, quote, "a man sitting in his parked car," it's widely believed that the Zodiac was referencing the murder of police officer Sergeant Richard P. Raditich, who was 25 years old. He was killed on June 19th at 5:25 a.m., gunned down by 3 shots from a .38 caliber revolver at point-blank range through the driver's side window of his vehicle while he was sitting writing a parking ticket. Raditich was sitting in his police car near 643 Waller Street in San Francisco in the Lower Haight District, resulting in devastating injuries that claimed his life approximately 15 hours later. Local residents heard a vehicle speeding away from the scene, but the number of assailants involved in the murder of Raditich is unknown to this day. His murder shocked the whole community, with his death leaving behind his devoted wife Nancy and his 8-month-old daughter Janine. This was almost certainly the murder the Zodiac was referring to in his correspondence, but because newspaper reports of the crime had already been released, the inability of Zodiac to supply any unique details of the crime in the letter, known only to him and the police, has led many people in the Zodiac community to believe that the Zodiac was simply claiming another murder he played no part in. However, he did claim that there is more glory in killing a cop than a kid, because a cop can shoot back, in a communication mailed on April 20th, 1970, just 2 months later.
1 month later, on July the 26th, 1970, 2 days after his claim to the abduction of Kathleen Johns near Modesto, the Zodiac killer mailed a lengthy correspondence promising to torture his slaves in paradise, followed by 2 sections from the Mikado, a Gilbert Sullivan comic opera set in Japan that opened to the paying public at the Savoy Theatre in London in 1885. Many members of the Zodiac community believe the prominent character of Coco, the Lord High Executioner, featured in the Mikado, may have inspired the costume worn by the Zodiac killer at Lake Berryessa on September the 27th, 1969. In the letter, the Zodiac Killer would comprehensively paraphrase the Mikado's "as someday it may happen," in which it refers to a little list in which victims must be found, along with the act of a more humane Mikado, in which billiard players must play in a darkened dungeon with crooked cues and twisted shoes. The introduction of the communication described the torture techniques the Zodiac Killer would employ upon his slaves. Quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. Being that you will not wear some nice buttons, how about wearing some nasty buttons, or any kind of buttons that you can think up? If you do not wear any type of buttons, I shall, on top of everything else, torture all 13 of my slaves that I have waiting for me in paradise. Some I shall tie over ant hills and watch them scream and twitch and squirm. Others shall have pine splinters driven under their nails and then burned. Others shall be placed in cages and fed salt beef until they are gorged. Then I shall listen to their pleas for water, and I shall laugh at them. Others will hang by their thumbs and burn in the sun. Then I will rub them down with deep heat to warm them up. Others I shall skin them alive and let them run around screaming. And all billiard players I shall have them play in a darkened dungeon cell with crooked cues and twisted shoes. Yes, I shall have great fun inflicting the most delicious of pain to my slaves." This communication was withheld from the newspapers for reasons unknown, first being revealed in the San Francisco Chronicle article by Paul Avery on October the 12th, 1970, and featured alongside another potential Zodiac communication mailed on October the 5th, 1970. The second correspondence was a postcard punched with 13 holes and pasted with newspaper cuttings. It read, quote, "Dear editor, you'll hate me, but I've got to tell you, the pace isn't any slower. In fact, it's just one big 13th. Some of them thought it was horrible." Pasted upside down in the bottom left corner was the wording, "There are reports city police pig cops are closing in on me. FK, I'm crack-proof. What is the price tag now?" In the centre of the card was a prominent number 13, under which was a crucifix made of thin red paper. The postcard was pasted with the oversized word of Zodiac and his Celtic cross.
The authenticity of the 13-hole postcard has been widely debated for many years. But the fact that the little list letter was withheld from newspapers until a Paul Avery article in the San Francisco Chronicle on October 12, 1970, and was published subsequent to the mailing date of the 13-hole postcard, suggests that if a hoaxer was responsible for the postcard, he would have no knowledge of the contents of the little list letter, and the contents would unlikely have continued the theme of the little list letter. The little list letter began by threatening to torture his slaves in paradise, stating, quote, "Some I shall tie over anthills and watch them scream and twitch and squirm. Others shall have pine splinters driven under their nails, and then burned. Others shall be placed in cages and fed salt beef until they are gorged. Then I shall listen to their pleas for water, and I shall laugh at them. Others will hang by their thumbs and burn in the sun. Then I will rub them down with deep heat to warm them up. Others I shall skin them alive and let them run around screaming. And all billiard players I shall have them play in a darkened dungeon cell with crooked cues and twisted shoes. Yes, I shall have great fun inflicting the most delicious of pain to my slaves." Then the Zodiac continued to paraphrase the Mikado's, "as someday it may happen," stating, "as someday it may happen that a victim must be found." These promises by the Zodiac to find and torture some victims are laid out in the future tense, with the emphasis on the words some and others in his torture plans. So it's not surprising that the following 13-hole postcard not only continued with the same victim total as the little list letter, but now the Zodiac had reverted to the past tense, stating, "Some of them fought. It was horrible." The Zodiac seemed to be insinuating that he had now completed his torture of slaves in paradise, converting, "as someday it may happen," into, Some of them fought. It was horrible. This running theme between both communications could only have been known by the Zodiac because of the decision to not publish the contents of the little list letter until October 12, 1970, reasonably dispelling any notion that the October 5, 1970 postcard was manufactured by a hoaxer.
5 days after the October the 12th, 1970 San Francisco Chronicle article, another pasted postcard, postmarked October the 17th from Berkeley, California, was mailed to the home of psychiatrist Dr. Edward C. Adams at 102 Camino Don Miguel, Orinda, California. The pasted wording read, Monday, October the 12th, 1970, Edward Adams. The Zodiac is going to change the way of committing murders. I shall announce when I shall commit my murders. The Adamses are next. You taught me to mean it. Adams, you are next. Zodiac. The redacted version of this communication was acquired by Mike Morford in 2011. A communication that had never been previously released to the public, making the threat of "you are next" on the card extremely significant when we consider an advertisement placed in the San Francisco Chronicle 6 years later, again accompanied by the pseudonym Zodiac. On August the 26th, 1976, to run for 1 week, an advertisement was placed in the Chronicle newspaper reading, Zodiac, your partner is in deep real estate. You're next. The Imperial Wizard can save you. Surrender to him or I'll terminate your case. R.A. The author of the personal ad used the same style threat as the Edward C. Adams letter, only altering "you are next" to "you're next." Lyndon Lafferty, author of the book The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up, The Silence Badge, identified an individual who worked at Gladman Hospital in Oakland. He was a psychiatrist by the name of Richard H. Adler, thereby giving us the initials R.A. typed in the advertisement. We now have an October the 17th, 1970 and August the 26th, 1976 message with an extremely similar threat, and if Lyndon Lafferty was correct, then both recipients were psychiatrists, living and working in close proximity to one another. The Gladman Hospital, where Richard H. Adler worked, is today listed as a psychiatric health facility in Oakland. The Gladman Hospital was a traditional psychiatric hospital back in 1976, extremely interesting and noteworthy, bearing in mind the FBI file concerning the Edward C. Adams letter, which indicates Dr. Adams informed Inspector Dave Toschi of his belief that the threatening letter he received was sent by a former psychiatric patient who resided in Berkeley. The city of Berkeley lies on the east shore of San Francisco Bay in northern Alameda County, adjacent to Oakland. Edward C. Adams spent most of his life in the Bay Area, where he attended the University of California, Berkeley, for his undergraduate work, and Stanford University for his medical degree. His residency in psychiatry was received at the Menninger Clinic, Topeka, Kansas. During the Korean War, he was an instructor in the Medical Field Service at Fort Sam, Houston, San Antonio, Texas. After retiring from an active practice in psychiatry, he devoted his energies to travel, fly fishing, the study of poetry, and the enjoyment of his family and many friends. During the time spent at his Carmel home, he volunteered as a docent at the Robinson Jeffers Foundation. He was a member of the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Society and an active supporter of many environmental groups. The San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis was organized in 2007, combining the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute and Society, founded in 1941, with the San Francisco Foundation for Psychoanalysis, founded in 1991. The center provides an extensive training program in psychoanalysis. The The centre also sponsors a large, vibrant extension division which offers classes and seminars to mental health professionals as well as to the general public. The San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute and Society was a facility for psychoanalytic research, training and education located on 2420 Sutter Street in San Francisco, California. It is situated in Lower Pacific Heights, approximately 1 mile from the intersection of Washington and Cherry, where Paul Stine was murdered on October the 11th, 1969. Was the wording of "You taught me to mean it" on the Edward Adams pasted communication indicative of a killer who had attended one of the psychiatrist's classes or had a one-to-one relationship with him in the past?
Talking of Paul Stine, Richard, Zodiac researcher Alex Lewis managed to secure a redacted document from the FBI in 2016 regarding the murder of Paul Stine in Presidio Heights on October 11, 1969. The redacted document read, Xenophon Lusby Anthony, white male adult, date of birth 28 February 1931, resides at 3218 Jackson Street, San Francisco. For Information Identification Division, SFP Department advised 8-year-old witness in murder of cab driver identified Anthony as possible subject in this matter. Just 10 days after the Paul Stine murder on Tuesday, October 21, 1969, an 8-year-old girl was walking along Lake Mendocino Drive in Ukiah, California with her parents when a passing motorist flung a note attached to a twig from his vehicle, landing at the young girl's feet. It read, "You're next. Z." On that same day, October 21st, an article was published in the Vallejo Times News Chronicle regarding Zodiac, titled, Suspect in Ukiah Cleared as Zodiac Searches Pressed. That man was Bruce Kenneth Swanson, who was arrested by the California Highway Patrol for speeding along Highway 101 at 120 miles per hour, just north of Ukiah, and he was suspected of failing to pay a Ridgewood motel bill. When his vehicle was searched, they found a 14-inch knife, a bloody shirt, a pair of shoes, and a woman's handbag. He was questioned for 6 hours, but released. We now have a scribed note flung from a vehicle in Ukiah on October 21, 1969, a pasted communication on October 17, 1970, threatening Dr. Edward Adams, and one advertisement dated August 26, 1976, all claiming to have originated from the Zodiac, spanning 7 years with the wording, "You're next, Z," followed by Adams, "You're next, Zodiac," and finally, Zodiac, your partners in deep real estate, you're next. But you would be mistaken if you think the story ends there. On June 1st, 1971, 7.5 months after the threatening correspondence on Edward C. Adams in Orinda, California, a woman from South Door Road in Ukiah complained she had received a series of threatening phone calls from an adult male, one of which made the threat, "This is Zodiac, you're next." Her residence at South Door Road was only 4 miles from where the threatening note of "You're next, Z" was thrown to the 8-year-old girl walking on Lake Mendocino Drive on October 21st, 1969.
Now, it would be remiss of me not to go into further detail on the Mount Diablo Code and present an extremely simple solution to where the Zodiac killer claimed he was going to bury his school bus bomb. Radians are supposed to be measured counterclockwise from the 3 o'clock position, but on June the 26th, 1970, the Zodiac killer drew his crosshairs on a map with a form of clock face, stating 0 was to be set to magnetic north, which was approximately 17 degrees in 1970. This suggested he may be employing radians in a clockwise direction, supported by his following communication on July the 26th, 1970. The answer to where his bus bomb was to be set would be revealed in 2 further crosshairs on the little list letter. The first crosshairs on the little list letter had a small, bold, black circle positioned around its circumference. When this was superimposed over a compass rose, the centre of this circle fell at 246 degrees, which is 4 radians a magnetic north. Next to the black circle was the acronym SFPD, so the target was a San Francisco Police Department, positioned at 4 radians a magnetic north from Mount Diablo. The second set of crosshairs on the little list letter had the overwritten wording of P.S. The Mount Diablo code concerns radians and inches along the radians. The Zodiac killer had inserted a hashtag before inches with an arrow pointing towards it. Despite the relatively recent explosion in popularity of the hashtag on social media, the number sign is most often used in front of a numeral in place of the word number, such as #1 instead of number 1. You can see this on the second page of the Paul Stein police report. The Zodiac killer was instructing us to insert a number before inches, hence his use of the hashtag symbol. The answer was P.S. The Mount Diablo code concerns radians and 5 inches along the radians, because this is the only possible answer based on the landmass of San Francisco and the map scale of 6.4 miles to the inch. Therefore, the answer to the location of the bomb is 4 radians a magnetic north and 5 inches from Mount Diablo. Whatever location the Zodiac killer chose to target, it was extremely unlikely it would have fell exactly on a round number of radians and inches, so he gave us an estimate. To a 98.5% accuracy, the San Francisco Police Department of Ingleside was 4 radians a magnetic north and 5 inches from Mount Diablo. In fact, the Zodiac killer was likely targeting the roadside edge alongside Ingleside Police Station in order to blow up a school bus under the noses of the San Francisco Police Department, thereby killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Now take a look at the school bus bomb diagram in the April 20th, 1970 letter. It depicts a school bus travelling from north to south with the sun rising to the east and an embankment to the right of the school bus. If you travel to the nearest section of roadway from Ingleside Police Station on Google Maps, just 274 feet away, you land on the Southern Freeway, which was a bus route for Thomas More Catholic School in 1970, in which a school bus would be travelling from north to south with the sun rising to the east. Drop down to street level and compare the embankment to the one depicted in the April 20th, 1970 letter. It mirrors it perfectly. Druza, an excellent Zodiac researcher, noted that if you place 4 radians and 5 inches from character 9 to 32 in the 32 symbol code, then place the word estimate at the beginning of the code from characters 1 to 8, the 3 repeating ciphertext characters match the 3 plaintext characters of E, S and A perfectly, giving a viable solution to the Mount Diablo code. Well, a good place to begin would be bridging the gap between the last podcast and this podcast. Now, 8 days before the button letter and Phillips 66 map on June the 18th, 1970, a letter was mailed to Gerald Taggart at 1423 Rolling Drive in Vallejo with a gift from Zodiac. Would you like to expand on this communication, Mike?
Yeah, it was definitely interesting. It was something that I had found when I was combing through the materials and looking for any sign of unreleased Zodiac materials, and that was one that I came across, and I dug into it, and I wanted to see if that could be released, and I reached out to a contact that I had in the investigation, and they told me that they didn't want to release it. That was a choice they made. To me, that strengthens the case that it could be a real Zodiac letter, because we've seen letters that are disputed or possibly fakes that have been released. But the fact they chose not to release this letter tells me something about it is of interest to them, and they wanted to hold that back. Now, I should point out that during the Zodiac reign, I think we talked about this probably in another episode, if you wanted to scare someone, if you wanted to play a joke on someone, anyone you had a gripe with, you could send them a letter with a thinly veiled threat saying this is from Zodiac and you would certainly scare them. And that's what they did to the Taggart family. And that's of interest because obviously it did that. It scared them and they brought it to the authorities, and that's how it got on the radar.
What makes you err on the side that this is a genuine Zodiac communication?
Mainly because they chose not to release it. If it was just another fake or someone playing a joke, what's the harm in releasing it? So to me, there's something in it that they wanted to hold back. They didn't want to release for investigative purposes. Maybe they're doing something with it in the lab. I don't know. That's just speculation.
In the last few months, Mike, you've been investigating a potential person of interest in the Zodiac case, which fits in with the 1423 Rolling Drive residence of Taggart. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. There's a suspect that's been dubbed Mason by some, and that was used in a podcast, Murder Was the Case, in which I was a guest talking about Mason. So we'll stick with Mason. And he actually fits in, interestingly enough, not so much at that address where the Taggarts lived in Vallejo, but later on they moved to Vacaville. I think it was in the mid to late 70s. And a suspect that lived very close to the phone booth on Springs and Tuolumne moved from that area of Springs and Tuolumne. That's the phone booth used by Zodiac on July 4th, 1969, after the Blue Rock Springs attack. He moved very close. I don't want to say how close, but it was very close to the Taggarts when they moved to Vacaville. So that puts a potential person of interest living very close to the phone booth used by Zodiac, 7469 or 7569 technically, and living very close to someone who had gotten a possible Zodiac letter. So when I say close, I'm talking within houses. We're not talking blocks or, we're very close. So I don't want to expand on it more than that, but could that be a coincidence? It may be, but it's just interesting that I can put one person living so close to a phone booth used by Zodiac and living so close to another person in another town later on who got a possible Zodiac letter.
Well, another little coincidence is a previous person of interest you paid some attention to a few years ago and interviewed him, and that was James Owen, who lived at Minnie Drive. And that residence at Minnie Drive was only 860 feet away from the residence of Gerald Taggart.
Yeah, that was very interesting too. And, I once considered James Owen a suspect, a person of interest, because of inconsistencies in his stories. I don't really consider him a person of interest now, but it was interesting when I saw that from his house, I think on an angle, you could see the Taggart's home from his house. So that was of interest. So I started looking at people in that vicinity because I thought to myself, maybe Zodiac was someone that lived close to the Taggarts and he'd get a thrill out of watching the police go knocking on their door and interacting with them, knowing that he had sent that letter. And that would be some way to get his kicks. So I looked at people in that general vicinity and continue to keep an eye out for people that are in that area.
If this was the Zodiac killer who sent this communication, why do you think this time he included a gift in it? In other words, why do you think he included the Oakland A tickets?
To me, I think it would have a little bit of shock value. If you got a scary letter from the Zodiac killer, all right, that would be frightening and you'd be disturbed by it and you'd go to police. But it would be almost in a joking manner if he sent you a gift, some baseball tickets. To me, it would be a way of just getting a kick, an extra laugh out of it, sending tickets like that to someone. And, I don't know. We don't know the full extent of the investigation. If police went to the game that night and sat in those seats or what happened to see if anyone showed up. But it's definitely interesting and worth discussing.
In the introduction, we covered the You Are Next letter, which was mailed in October. Now, 2 days before the series of menacing calls to Daniel Williams, which we've discussed before, who resided in Martinez, somebody threw a note to a school-age girl with the message, "You're next, Zed." This occurred on October the 21st, 1969 in Ukiah, California. On June the 1st, 1971, again in Ukiah, a woman reported menacing phone calls by somebody claiming to be the Zodiac killer. The location of the note incident and the woman on South Dora Road receiving the menacing phone calls are extremely close together. In fact, they're within 4 miles of each other. Yet this was 1971, when one would have thought Zodiac impersonators might have died down, notwithstanding the fact it was in Ukiah, 115 miles from San Francisco. What do you make of these events, Mike? And I would like to know if the woman at South Dora Road was a school teacher.
Well, that's interesting. You definitely have that time when that's during the stretch when Zodiac wasn't actively writing letters. I think his last 1971 letter was in March. So something happened in July of 1971 is of interest because that's in a time when you mentioned there's not a lot of Zodiac activity going on. He didn't write again until 1974. So you have to wonder if it's just someone keeping the interest alive and pranking someone and doing something along those lines. On the other hand, Zodiac did some stuff that we can't fully understand. We don't know why he did some of the things he did. So that might have been his way of staying in contact and harassing people without actually sending letters. I know you mentioned the school teacher, which is an interesting angle because I think in this case, there's been different people that have been mentioned as possibly receiving calls or being harassed. One of them is Lyndon Lafferty's suspect. In that case, there was a woman who was receiving calls. I think she was a school teacher, if I remember correctly. And, of course, we have Daniel Williams. He's a teacher. So if this other person receiving calls during that time was a teacher, that would be pretty interesting.
And we also had the Edward Adams card, which said, "You are next." We had the advertisement sent in 1976 to the Chronicle saying, "You're next," plus this with the twig thrown from the car with the message, "You're next, Z." So we have multiple occasions of the same phraseology used, attached to the Zodiac killer over a span of 6 years.
And some of it being centered in Ukiah is an interesting thing in itself because we know that Zodiac isn't active in the Bay Area in 1971, at least not in the summer of 1971. In the spring, he's mailing letters there. Perhaps he went to Ukiah for work or for school or for something we don't know about and was spending time there, and that was his way of harassing people. Yeah, so that's an interesting aspect or possibility is that it's Zodiac doing this stuff in Ukiah, but it's, he can't mail his letters from there because he's there for work or whatever the reason is.
Did you ever see the newspaper cutting, which was titled "Suspect in Ukiah Cleared as Zodiac Searches Pressed"? And that suspect was Bruce Kenneth Swanson, who grew up in San Bernardino, which we were talking about in the last episode. This guy looked exactly like the Lake Berryessa sketch, similar to the thing you noted with your recent person of interest. And that happened on October the 21st, 1969, and that was in Ukiah.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'd have to go back. It sounds familiar, but I don't know. I haven't looked at that in a while, so I may not have seen it recently, but I'm going to have to go back and look at it.
We'll move on to the Mount Diablo code. Now, it is without doubt that radians is a term that is rarely known by the average person. The Zodiac had a propensity to use compass directions in his letters, such as 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, Betty Lou Jensen's feet were to the west, 2 miles north of park headquarters, and the motorcycles went by about 150 feet away, going from south to northwest. The Zodiac had used compass directions in all of his canonical crimes. Then came the Phillips 66 map with his radians and inches, giving us directions to where his bomb was to be set. Do you believe this in any way reveals his education, profession, or hobbies?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of stuff in his speech and his communication that isn't something the average Joe would use. I think radians and things like that, a special skill, special knowledge for people. I don't know a lot about them, and I think most people wouldn't. So you have to question, is that something Zodiac used in his everyday life for work? Was he trained in that stuff? Did he go to college for that stuff? Those are all things that are worth asking, and he certainly had a knowledge. Now, could he have gotten some of that out of books and wanted to make himself sound smarter? It's possible, but to me, that seems like a weird thing to reach for, to just say, hey, I want to mention radians and stuff. Why would someone that doesn't know anything about radians choose radians to start talking about? So unless he read some kind of interesting article that caught his attention about radians and then thought that would be a cool thing to talk about, I tend to think that he had some kind of knowledge or experience along those lines.
Yeah, he could have easily learnt it just as we did it. Okay, we can look up on Wikipedia and find out and learn about radians within 15 minutes. But he could have done something similar from the library while he was just casually flicking through a magazine in similar fashion to we have discovered it, because it actually doesn't take that long to learn about radians, but it might well be part of his profession. Have you ever thought about what profession you have honed in on that may be the profession of the Zodiac Killer?
Well, I gave up a long time ago trying to figure out what profession Zodiac may have had, because I think there's endless possibilities. Obviously, the military one comes to mind because of the dress and a couple of the clues as far as shoe prints and things like that. So I think that's got to be on the list. You know, obviously cipher training and stuff like that, some people in the military get as well. So to me, that's the one thing I'm always keeping an open mind to. But I think Zodiac could have been just about anyone. I think he could have been someone that worked at a newspaper, someone that worked in a prison system. I think there's no limit to what Zodiac could have done. I do think that he probably spent some time underachieving, wrapped up in his Zodiac capers, that he probably didn't excel to his fullest potential. So I think you might see a stretch where he didn't do well at his job, or maybe he had training and was working at a menial job because his main interest was doing the Zodiac stuff. So that's something I'm always on the lookout for too, is if someone has a stretch of time that they're doing something that's beneath their training, or just not working at all because they're focusing on the Zodiac crimes.
Well, we'll move forward a little bit to the 13-hole postcard mailed on October 5th, 1970. For those who aren't convinced the 13-hole postcard and the Adams card are genuine, Mike, may want to consider a link between the little list letter, which featured the Mikado, and the Halloween card. One of the characters in the Mikado is Peep Bo. Now, Peep Bo is an English phrase used by parents on their children, hiding one's face behind your hands and then revealing your face and exclaiming Peep Bo. Wikipedia explains that sometimes trees are involved, giving the example of hiding behind that tree. Therefore, it's extremely unusual that the next widely accepted communication after the little list letter would contain the phrase peekaboo written around the knot hole of the tree. Peekaboo is a widely used phrase in America. Now, 3 years after the release of Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado, another production called the Texas Mikado changed the character Peep Bo to Peekaboo. Was the Zodiac Killer emulating the Lord High Executioner dressed in his costume behind the tree at Lake Berryessa? And can we forge any correlation between the costume design and his apparent theatrical leanings, along with the language he adopted in his communications? In other words, could he have been employed in the theatre industry?
Well, I think that's a definite possibility. You know, we know he has an interest in theater type stuff. The costume design, possibly, you get into that angle. I know there was the Lamplighters theater group out of San Francisco. I know during the run of Gilbert and Sullivan production, during the entire run, there wasn't a Zodiac letter during that run, which led some people to think that he was somehow connected to that cast and working on that production, and for whatever reason didn't have time to or chose not to mail any letters during that. I know they were looked at pretty closely by investigators, the whole group that put on that show, but I think it's definitely possible that at the very least there was interest or training or theater background for him, and he drew on that in his costumes and his presentations and his style of sending these letters and cards and tying little clues into each one.
Wasn't there something in the History Channel documentary that covered Ross Sullivan and the theatre?
I hate to say it, but as much as I know about Ross Sullivan, I do not remember anything about the theater other than he did do a little student film with a guy that went on to become a Hollywood type who made some movies. But in high school in the 50s, Ross had played the lead role of a villain, a bad guy. And I tried to get my hands on that just to see and hear Ross talk, but unfortunately, the film was lost to time, I guess. But that's as far as I know, his connection to any kind of theater was that little student film he participated in.
In a few podcasts' time, we will be talking about Sherry Jo Bates. Probably do a couple of podcasts on it. Do you want to just lead us into that a little bit concerning the Little List letter when you consider the phraseology of scream and twitch and squirm?
Yeah, there's some interesting things that we'll be able to dissect once we get into that episode. That correlation between Zodiac and an author that sent letters in Sherry's case. And again, we're talking years apart. You were talking letters in November 1966, and then we're talking 4 years later, almost, in July of 1970 when Zodiac sent his little list letter. There's some phrases and words that are identical and even include the same misspelled words, which leads me, I've long believed that there's a strong possibility that the Zodiac was at least the letter writer in the Sherry Jo Bates case. And if that's the case, then we need to focus on people that were down in Riverside during that time frame when she was killed, 1966 to 1967, when letters were mailed in her case. But it's an interesting lead to pursue to see if it's a true link or if it's some kind of crazy coincidence. Again, not getting too far ahead of ourselves, we'll be able to explain a little bit more in detail once we're into that episode.
Do you think there's a possibility, Mike, that the Zodiac inserted scream and twitch and squirm from the Inside Detective magazine in 1969 to suggest to people that he may have been involved with the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966? In other words, he was trying to plant a seed.
Yeah, I think it's very possible that he did. The Inside Detective January 1969 issue has a reproduction of the letter, which you and I were just discussing as we were getting ready for this episode. The view that we have of it, it's a poor quality. You can't see if the reproduction, what was included. But the text of the confession letter is included. And what's interesting is in the text, the magazine article spells the words twitch right. But in the confession letter, the author, as well as the little list letter, Zodiac, both spell that word incorrectly. So my thinking is if Zodiac just saw that letter and thought, oh, I'm going to use this, it sounds pretty neat, I'll make myself sound like this person from Riverside, how would he know that the person in Riverside spelled twitch wrong? So that brings up an interesting point. Is it visible in the reproduction that we can't see in the copy we were looking at? I don't know, but if it wasn't, if there's not a good version that spells the word incorrectly, then I'd have a hard time believing that Zodiac later on would somehow choose those words and misspell the word, because he wouldn't know that it was misspelled in the confession letter. Then again, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, especially for listeners that aren't well versed in the case. In the Bates case, there is handwriting that's been linked by the state's top expert, Sherwood Morrill, who did all the Zodiac letters. He linked the writing in that case as being from Zodiac. So we have a possibility that Zodiac was writing the letters in Riverside in 1966 to 1967, and then later became the Zodiac. So it's either or. He's either the same author of both sets of letters, or Zodiac just somehow chose these writings from the Bates case and somehow had writing that was close enough that fooled the state's top writing expert as well. Because it's not just the words, it's the examination that was done by Sherwood Morrill.
Another thing with the 13-hole postcard is the red paper crucifix that he placed on the card. Now, most of the card was pasted text, but he seemed to go out of his way to put a thin red piece of paper of a crucifix on that card. Now, when we think of a red paper crucifix, we might think of Jesus Christ, crucifixion on the cross, that sort of thing. There was 13 punched holes in the fabric of that card. 3 holes to the side of the 10 are positioned exactly where the 3 8s are on the April the 20th, 1970 code. In other words, if you take those 3 circles are positioned in between the circles above, if you slide them up into the gaps of the 10 above, those 3 fit perfectly where the 3 8s are on the April the 20th, 1970 code. In English gematria, the number 888 represents Jesus Christ, so that ties those 2 cards together to some extent. Now, I will go into much further detail when we talk about the ciphers in a later podcast, but I'll just briefly say, if we place the FKM crackproof phrase from the 13-hole postcard into the 13-symbol code, beginning on the first circled H, each element of the phrase FKM crackproof begins where each 8 begins and forms a circular cipher because it starts with F and ends with F. It also satisfies the introduction to the April the 20th letter stating, "Have you cracked the last cipher I sent you? My name is FK. I'm crackproof." It also answers the challenge laid down by Dr. Marsh of the American Cryptogram Association by giving a partial answer to the request for the Zodiac Killer's name. What are your thoughts, Mike, on the 13-hole postcard and its follow-up on October the 17th from Berkeley?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely shows some artistic abilities, assuming this is a real Zodiac communication. I think it is. It shows that in addition to writing letters, the Zodiac also was able to construct different types of messages using cutout words and things like that. You mentioned the numbers, the cross, the dots. There's so many different things there that seem to be some kind of message. That message is, I don't know. I think that's open to interpretation, or maybe one day we'll figure it out if we can solve the case. But it seems definite that Zodiac was trying to send some kind of message there. Yeah, it's definitely possible that the letter to Edward Adams, again, made up of cutout pieces, it seems like if that's a genuine Zodiac letter along with the postcard, then he, for whatever reason, he was choosing to cut stuff together and construct stuff rather than handwrite things. But the timing of the dates is interesting, as you mentioned, and I think it bears consideration that these may be genuine Zodiac communications. So we just looked in this edition of the magazine, and it's shown, I should say, 2 different ways. The text of the message in the confession letter is spelled correctly, but the author of the confession letter, the image of the confession letter, which is again not the real version, but it's spelled exactly as the author spelled it. It spells Twitch incorrectly. So we have 2 different versions in this one magazine of how to spell the word Twitch. And the author in the real confession letter misspelled Twitch. Zodiac later on misspelled Twitched. So again, he may have looked at the text, he may have looked at the image and chose to duplicate that. It's interesting that because my mind, just thinking back over all these clues and details from so many years of doing this, I somehow thought that was not available until after the little list letter came from Zodiac. And now I see that it was available in 1969, so Zodiac could have read that and pulled that information. So that's making me look at things in a little bit of a new light now, because, had it been something that was not published, not available, and that word was misspelled by Zodiac, that to me would be a lot more damning. But this is something that's going to give me a little bit of a pause there. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac. Or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site, zodiacciphers.com, or by going to Mike's site, at zodiackillersite.com.
We'd like to take a moment to thank all the people that have reached out to Rich and I to say congrats on starting Zodiac Speaking, or to compliment us on the podcast or the material we've covered so far. We really appreciate all the support, and if you'd like to help us grow, please take a minute to rate us and leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. You can also recommend Zodiac Speaking to your friends. We'll be doing a special Q&A episode coming up, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to reach out to us on social media, or you can email us questions directly at zodiacspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. As we wrap up this episode of Zodiac Speaking, Rich and I would like to play a preview for you for a really good true crime podcast, Ignorance Was Bliss. Be sure to give it a listen.
Hey, this is Kate. I'm a forensic psychologist and crisis clinician, and I collect stories. Everything from true crime to trauma to parenthood. There's a lot more in common between depression and sociopathy, or between serial killers and podcasters, than you might think. Are you sure you really want to know? This is Ignorance Was Bliss at iwbpodcast.com and IWB Podcast on social media.